There's a prominent idea among some groups that our contemporary culture has eroded our collective morals, leading to a new phenomenon, the transgender queer now. This idea is often touted by traditionalists, people who look back to the time of ancient Rome as a bastion of the cultural purity and morality that they see missing in today's society. The idea that any time or place in history, let alone ancient Rome, could be divested from the queer is not only laughably short-sighted, but easily disproven by the historical record and by human sexual trends as a whole. For as long as there have been gender roles, likely around 65,000 years based on current anthropological and archaeological thought, there have been cross-gender or transgender behaviors. When I use transgender throughout this talk, I am sometimes talking about the contemporary usage, that being someone whose internal gender identity doesn't match with their external sexual characteristics. But most of the time, I'm using it in the general sense, across the binary, transported across the binary, transgender. When a woman is a mechanic or a man is an elementary school teacher, by our rigid definitions of the gender binary, both of them are exhibiting cross-gender or transgender behaviors. But for much longer than the 1950s, much before the 1950s, when contemporary figures like Christine Jorgensen brought transgender people into the public eye, there have been well-documented examples of transgender behavior in the historical record. One of these examples is that of Elagabalus, a short-lived Roman emperor only 200 years after the time of Christ, 200 CE, whichever you prefer. Elagabalus's short rule, lasting from when she was 14 to when she died at 18, was covered extensively by Roman senator and historian Cassius Dio. Dio's histories are rampant with the biases and prejudices that were inherent to Roman society, and especially regarding Elagabalus. In her time, Elagabalus was a very contentious figure, very criticized, both for her status as an Easterner and for her effeminacy, which would have been heavily criticized in Roman society, as Elagabalus was born male. Elagabalus, in this painting, I'm pointing it the wrong way, is right here. And I am referring to her as a woman. Elagabalus was criticized heavily for her status as an Easterner more than anything. The Roman view of Easterners, Elagabalus having been born in modern-day Syria being one, was that they were inherently weaker and more effeminate than their strong, masculine Roman counterparts. And additionally, Elagabalus played the female sexual role, which would have been not uncommon during Roman times, but was looked down upon for someone who had been born male, and even more so for someone of such a high position as the Roman emperor. Additionally, Cassius Dio describes Elagabalus's many marriages, most of which were to women. But Cassius Dio describes these marriages as having been for the benefit of her learning to better act the female part, to satisfy her husband, Heracles. Her marriage to Heracles itself is extremely interesting, as Heracles had been born a slave and he had been a slave his whole life, as well as a charioteer. And Elagabalus wanted to elevate him to the position of Caesar, a change that would have changed her role from that of emperor to empress, as she would have been the consort of the Caesar. Additionally, Elagabalus referred to herself as a lady rather than a lord, wore makeup and feminine garb, and reportedly asked multiple doctors if it would be possible for them to construct a vagina for her, something that goes well beyond the Eastern stereotyping of male effeminacy and takes her behaviors very soundly into the transgender. Additionally, you might have heard me say she asked for gender confirmation surgery. I said it two sentences ago. But Elagabalus made that request 1,700 years before the first successful male-to-female confirmation surgery would be done in Berlin, Germany in the 1930s. This sounds surprising, that any surgery of that kind would be performed that early, let alone in Berlin. But in the late 1920s, Berlin was a mecca of queer life, centered around the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, headed by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. Dr. Hirschfeld, himself a gay Jewish man in an interracial relationship, provided surgeries and employment to an unknown number of transgender people in the years before Hitler came to power. Unsurprisingly, in 1933, after the Nazis had taken over Germany, the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft was destroyed, and Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's library, containing a library of Alexandria worth of sexological research, magazines, just documents of life, was destroyed. And in the aftermath, an unknown number of or underdocumented employees and patients of the Institute, most of whom were transgender, disappeared, their fates left as ambiguous as they could be in Nazi Germany. These are just two examples of transgender histories that are very often lost or purposefully obscured from the historical record, often in the goal of serving cultural purification, especially in the example of the Nazis. But there are a lot more examples that are a lot closer to us, that are lost because they exist in oral histories or non-Anglophone, non-English, Latinate languages. One such example is that of the Muxes in Oaxaca, Mexico. The Zapotec culture in Oaxaca, Mexico sports a very large and visible population of third gender individuals, most of whom are born as men and exhibit a feminine nature later in life. And in Zapotec culture, having a Muxe child is considered a blessing to a family because of the way the rest of the world treats third gender children, transgender children. Most Muxe children remain at home with their families, staying to become caregivers not only to their communities and their parents, but their environment. Closer to us still, in Turtle Island, which is where we all are, by the way, the indigenous Two-Spirit community before colonial contact were often revered parts of their communities, acting as spiritual leaders, community leaders, artists, historians. Many indigenous Two-Spirits were the only people allowed to introduce new beadwork patterns in certain communities. And despite over 300 years of attempted elimination under the guise of forced assimilation, they are still here with us and still acting as artists, activists, and community leaders. Transgender histories are very often lost or purposefully obscured from the historical record by the very same people who continuously act like we are new to the world, shocking themselves with history they themselves suppressed. Transgender behaviors are not some new phenomenon brought on by Hollywood or cell phones or microplastics in the water. They have always been here, as long as humanity as we know it has been here, and they will exist long after you and I are gone. Transgender people, the problem is not that transgender people are some new aberrant cultural phenomenon insulting to societal norms. The problem is that we have continuously been hidden, killed, and explained away because our language doesn't quite match up or we don't behave the same way across time and place. Something that is impossible to ask of any community, let alone one that has not been allowed to exist in peace long enough to develop a coherent collective identity. When we look to the historical record for transgender histories, for cross-gender histories, we're not looking for a one-to-one analogy of what our contemporary existence is. We are looking for a place where we can point and say, I see myself, I see myself, I see myself, I see myself. And we are saying that this and we are not some new phenomenon. and we're not going anywhere. Thank you.